Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, this is going to be, I think, a really insightful one today. We're diving into a topic that I think is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Oh, for sure. It's something that touches a lot of lives.
Yeah, we're talking about emotionally immature parents and the impact that that has on their adult children.
A huge topic.
Yeah, huge. And, we're going to be looking specifically at the work of Lindsay C. Gibson in her book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents.
And it really gets to the heart of something I see a lot in my practice. It's this kind of underlying emotional loneliness.
Yeah, and the thing that's so interesting about it is that you can have what looks like a perfectly normal or even successful childhood on the surface. You have your basic needs met.
Right, a roof over your head, food on the table.
But still end up carrying this sense of emptiness.
Exactly. That's what's so tricky about it. It's not always obvious. Not like you can point to a specific traumatic event.
It's much more subtle than that.
Right, and it's these unmet emotional needs, these longings for connection and validation that never quite get fulfilled.
And that can really linger and shape how we experience the world as adults.
Absolutely.
So in this deep dive, we're hoping to shed some light on this often overlooked aspect of the parent-child relationship.
Yeah, we're going to unpack some of the key concepts from Lindsay Gibson's book.
And really help you, the listener, understand if some of the emotional loneliness you might be feeling could actually be traced back to your experiences with your parents.
And I think it's important to point out that Lindsay Gibson isn't just offering armchair psychology here. I mean, she's a seasoned therapist.
Decades of experience, right?
Exactly. And she's grounded her work in solid psychological research. So we're not just dealing with opinions or anecdotes.
This is real deep stuff.
It is. And the book has resonated with so many experts in the field, people like Dr. Esther Lerman-Freeman, Dr. Neil Watson, Dr. Robin Cutler. They've all praised its insightful blend of wisdom, research, practical guidance, and just a deep understanding of family dynamics.
Yeah, so we're in good hands.
Definitely.
So let's start with the basics then. What exactly are we talking about when we say emotionally immature parents?
Well, it really boils down to this sort of fundamental discomfort with genuine emotion. And I don't mean just having a bad day now and then.
Right, we all have those.
Of course. But this is more of a deep-seated pattern, a way of being in the world that avoids really engaging with deep feelings.
Both their own and their children's.
Precisely. They tend to resist reality in a way.
Resist reality.
Yeah, they might use coping mechanisms like denial or distortion, kind of trying to replace what is actually happening with what they wish were happening.
So almost like a fantasy world.
In a sense.
Yeah.
And they often struggle with self-reflection.
So having those really honest conversations where you can look at your own part in things, that's really difficult.
Extremely. And that often translates into a difficulty taking responsibility for their actions or offering sincere apologies.
I can imagine how destabilizing that would be for a kid.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're trying to make sense of the world, and the adults in your life aren't being straight with themselves, let alone with you.
That's like a shaky foundation.
Exactly. And it creates this unpredictable emotional environment for the child because the parents' responses are often inconsistent.
You never know what to expect.
Right. So you're constantly walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate their moods, trying to figure out how to avoid triggering a negative reaction.
And I imagine a big part of this emotional immaturity is that the parents' own needs always seem to come first.
Yeah, that's a crucial aspect. They often prioritize their own desires and comfort over their children's emotional well-being.
So if there's a conflict between what the parent wants and what the child needs emotionally,
the child's needs usually get pushed aside.
So how does growing up in this kind of environment actually lead to that feeling of emotional loneliness we were talking about earlier?
Well, imagine being a child who's constantly trying to connect emotionally with a parent who's essentially unavailable.
Like knocking on a door that never opens.
Exactly. And because these parents are often uncomfortable with emotions themselves and sometimes lacking in empathy.
Empathy being that ability to really step into someone else's shoes and understand their feelings.
Right. They don't really see or understand their children's inner world.
Yeah.
There's this fundamental disconnect.
So even though the family is physically together, they're emotionally miles apart.
Precisely. And this can leave the child feeling profoundly alone, even within their own family.
It's like that saying about being in a crowded room, but still feeling completely invisible.
Exactly. David, whose experience is shared in the book, describes this feeling so poignantly. He says, I always felt incredibly lonely, like I was utterly isolated. And for him, this wasn't just an occasional feeling. He says, it was a fact of my existence. It just felt normal.
Wow, that's powerful.
He even had this vivid image of floating in the ocean with no one around me.
Hmm.
is how he experienced his childhood, just this constant sensation of emptiness and nothingness.
And another story that really stuck with me was Rhonda's. She describes this memory from when she was 7 years old during a family move. And even though her family was physically there, she felt totally alone trying to figure out what was going on.
And she felt like nobody had really explained what this move would mean for her emotionally.
So she's in this new environment surrounded by her family, but completely emotionally adrift.
Right. And she talks about feeling exhausted from trying to cope on her own because her family felt totally unavailable.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And these feelings don't just magically disappear when you become an adult.
So even if you build a seemingly successful or outwardly normal life, that core wound of emotional loneliness can still be there.
And often as it can really impact your relationships, your career choices, even your sense of self-worth.
And it's almost tragic that sometimes this emotional loneliness of childhood gets repeated in adult relationships.
That's one of the most painful patterns I see in my practice. Individuals unconsciously find themselves drawn to partners who are also emotionally unavailable.
It's like they're recreating the familiar, even if it's ultimately hurtful.
Exactly. It's like our emotional compass gets set to what we know,
Yeah.
even if what we know is unhealthy.
We gravitate towards what feels comfortable, even if it's not ultimately good for us.
Right. Sophie's story in the book is a perfect example of this. She'd been dating Jerry for 5 years, and from the outside, it looked like she had a great life.
The perfect relationship.
But underneath it all, she was deeply frustrated by his lack of emotional intimacy. And through therapy, she started to see the striking similarities between Jerry's emotional insensitivity and her own mother's lack of empathy.
So she was basically reliving her childhood loneliness in her adult relationship.
Exactly, and she felt so guilty about it because on paper, she had everything she should have been happy.
That guilt is such a common theme, isn't it?
It is, because there's this societal message that if your basic needs were met in childhood, you have no right to complain.
Like you should just be grateful and get on with it.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
But the truth is, emotional connection is just as fundamental a human need as food or shelter.
It's not a luxury, it's essential.
Exactly. And the book really drives this point home. It says, while any good relationship takes effort, making an emotional connection should be the easy part.
It should be the natural foundation.
Right. It should be the thing that just flows effortlessly.
And it's important to emphasize that this isn't just a women's issue.
Definitely not. I mean, statistically, women might seek psychotherapy more often, but emotional loneliness in relationships is something that many men experience too.
And in some ways, it can be even more challenging for them because of societal expectations.
Right. There's often this pressure on men to be strong and stoic, to not show their feelings.
And that can lead to a lot of bottled up emotion.
Absolutely. And if you look at the tragic statistics around suicide and violence, particularly among men who are emotionally isolated and lack intimacy, it really underscores the devastating consequences of this unmet need.
I'm thinking of Jake's story from the book.
Oh, yes. Jake, he was so terrified of being emotionally honest with his partner, Kayla, because his mother had always been so angry and controlling.
He'd learned that showing any kind of need made him weak and unlovable.
Exactly. And even though he was in a loving, secure relationship, those old childhood messages were still so deeply ingrained.
He felt comfortable acting happy and trying to please Kayla.
But the thought of actually sharing his vulnerabilities was terrifying for him.
Like he would be judged or rejected.
He was afraid of being seen as pitiful and needy.
It took him a long time to unlearn those damaging messages and start to believe that he could be loved for who he truly was.
It's a process. And it's not just romantic relationships either. This emotional loneliness can show up in all kinds of relationships.
With our parents, our friends, even at work.
Exactly. And it often leaves you feeling drained, like you're always giving, but never quite receiving the emotional sustenance you need.
I am reminded of Louise's story and her struggles with her mother.
Oh, yes. Louise, she was constantly battling her mother's manipulative guilt trips.
It was like her mother was trying to keep her emotionally dependent.
Exactly, and Louise felt so trapped.
It took a lot of courage for her to finally break free and prioritize her own life.
It did. And she had to learn to tolerate the guilt that came with setting those boundaries.
Which can be incredibly difficult.
It is, but it's often a necessary step towards reclaiming your own emotional well-being.
Another thing that struck me in the book was how this kind of upbringing can really mess with our ability to trust our own instincts.
Yes, absolutely, because emotionally immature parents often invalidate their children's feelings and intuitions.
So you learn to doubt yourself.
Exactly. You start to second-guess your own judgment. And you might end up deferring to what others think is right, even if it doesn't feel right in your gut.
And that can lead to making choices that ultimately aren't in your best interest.
Precisely. Megan's story really illustrates this. She knew deep down that her relationship wasn't right.
But her parents were pushing her to marry someone wealthy.
Right. They prioritized those external markers of success over her actual happiness.
And she ended up feeling incredibly confused and guilty for wanting to leave years later.
Because she'd been taught to value what others think over her own inner compass.
It's so sad how those early experiences can shape our expectations of what we deserve.
And it can even lead us to create our own emotional loneliness as adults.
How so?
Well, sometimes the damage to our self-confidence is so profound that we start to withdraw from interactions or hold back from forming close connections.
Because we don't believe we're worthy of love or connection.
Exactly. Ben's story is a good example of this. Even though he had married a wonderful woman, he couldn't understand why she would choose to be with him.
His mother's constant rejection had convinced him that he was somehow undesirable.
Right. He saw himself as someone who was easily overlooked and taken for granted, even in a loving relationship.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
In a way, yes. And Charlotte's experience of winning a writing contest is another example of how deeply ingrained this expectation of rejection can become.
She was a successful journalist, but still completely surprised and disbelieving when she won this prestigious award.
Because she was still viewing her current reality through the lens of past rejection, even though all evidence pointed to her success and talent.
So even when we achieve great things, that inner voice of self-doubt can still be there.
Absolutely. It can take a lot of conscious effort to rewire those negative beliefs.
And it's interesting how those past experiences can continue to haunt us, even in our dreams.
Yes, past emotional neglect can manifest in persistent anxiety and even recurring dreams that replay those old feelings of helplessness and isolation.
I'm thinking of Natalie and her recurring nightmare.
Oh yes, Natalie. She had this incredibly vivid dream where she was all alone carrying the weight of impossible responsibilities with no one to help her. And it was a direct reflection of her childhood experience with emotionally unavailable parents.
Like her subconscious was still trying to process that deep sense of abandonment.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that our need for emotional connection isn't just about feeling good. It's actually hardwired into our biology.
We're literally wired for connection.
Precisely throughout human evolution, being part of a supportive group has meant greater safety and reduced stress.
There's safety in numbers.
Exactly. And Stephen Porges' research on the vagus nerve shows how comforting physical contact actually lowers our stress hormones and slows our heart rate.
So cuddling is good for you.
It's not just about feeling good. It's about regulating our nervous system.
And this need for connection is especially crucial in times of stress or trauma.
Absolutely. Research has shown time and again that people who have endured extreme circumstances often draw immense strength from their relationships.
It's that sense of belonging and support that helps them get through.
Right. And this brings us to the concept of emotional neglect, which can be quite subtle and easily overlooked.
Because it's not as obvious as physical neglect or abuse.
Exactly. But it can be just as damaging in the long run.
So what are some signs of emotional neglect?
Well, it often involves a persistent feeling of not being properly watched, over a sense of being fundamentally alone and unprotected in the world, and needing to constantly be on guard for your own well-being.
It's like you never feel truly safe or secure.
Precisely the story of the 4-year-old being left alone on a crowded beach really captures this sense of emotional abandonment.
Even though the parent was physically present, they weren't emotionally present.
Right, and over time, children who experience this kind of neglect can develop a rejecting attitude towards their own feelings.
Because they've learned that their emotions aren't welcome or safe to express.
Exactly. Leah's story is a good example of this. She actually apologized to her therapist for being depressed because she was so worried about being a burden.
She'd internalized that belief that her feelings were wrong or inconvenient.
And another form of emotional neglect is when parents offer superficial comfort that doesn't actually address the child's real needs.
Like those generic reassurances, oh, you'll be fine.
Exactly. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
It doesn't actually address the underlying pain.
And this kind of upbringing can also lead to normalizing dysfunctional behavior in relationships.
So what's actually unhealthy starts to feel normal.
Precisely, especially for internalizers. They tend to turn inward and process their experiences internally, so they might not even realize that something is wrong.
Vivian's hesitation to even mention her husband's anger in therapy is a good example of this.
Right. She was afraid of it being seen as strange or abnormal because it was her normal.
And the man who recounted his childhood abuse so casually is another example.
It's like those experiences become so ingrained that they lose their shock value.
It's a defense mechanism in a way, but it can also prevent you from seeking help or recognizing red flags.
Definitely. And internalizers often end up taking on an excessive amount of emotional work in these family dynamics.
They become the caretakers.
Exactly. They become the listeners, the advice givers, the peacemakers. They end up parenting their own parents in a way.
Long before they're emotionally equipped to handle that kind of responsibility.
Right. The woman who only realized the extent of the emotional labor she'd been doing after her divorce is a good example.
It's like a hidden burden that they carry.
And it can be incredibly exhausting.
So let's talk a bit more about internalizers. What are some of their key characteristics?
Well, they're often highly perceptive and sensitive to the emotional states of others.
They're very tuned in to what's going on around them.
Exactly. And they have a deep need for connection and harmony, which is why growing up with emotionally immature parents can be so painful for them.
Because their needs aren't being met.
Right. And they often experience their emotions quite intensely, but they learn to avoid burdening others with their feelings.
So they keep it all bottled up inside.
And this can make them even easier for emotionally immature parents to overlook.
It's like they become invisible.
In a way, yes. And they often develop what's called a role self.
What's that?
It's basically an outward persona that's overly focused on meeting the needs of others.
So they're always putting others first.
Right. And they might also develop a healing fantasy.
A healing fantasy.
Yeah. This belief that if they just try hard enough, they can somehow change the emotionally immature people around them.
Like if they're just good enough or loving enough, they can fix the problem.
Exactly. And they learn to function with very little emotional support.
They become incredibly self-sufficient.
But it comes at a cost. They end up carrying a lot of resentment and exhaustion.
Logan's story from the book really captures this internalizer struggle.
Oh, yes. Logan, she was so successful professionally, but underneath it all, she felt this deep sense of emptiness and loneliness.
Because her parents were so emotionally unavailable.
Right. She tried so hard to be the good little girl to win their love and approval.
But it never worked.
And she felt so angry and sad. But she often couldn't even articulate those feelings.
Because she'd learned to suppress them.
Exactly. And this brings us to the concept of the true self.
What's that?
It's basically who we are at our core, our authentic essence with all our needs and desires and values.
The real you.
Exactly. And the true self yearns to grow, to be known and seen by others, to express itself freely and authentically.
So it's about aligning ourselves with who we truly are.
Right. And the book has this great exercise where you reflect on your childhood desires and then imagine your current aspirations if external pressures like money were no object.
So you can see the difference between what you truly want and what you've been conditioned to want.
Exactly. And that can be a really powerful first step towards reconnecting with your true self.
But what happens when that gap between our true self and our lived experience becomes too big?
Well, that's often when what the book calls breakdowns occur.
Breakdowns?
Yeah. But it's important to understand that these aren't necessarily bad things.
They can actually be opportunities for growth.
Exactly. It's like the old saying, you have to break down to break through.
I like that.
And the psychologist Jean Piaget actually observed that old mental patterns often need to break down before new learning can take place.
So it's like clearing out the clutter to make space for something new.
Precisely. And there's also a theory called positive disintegration, developed by Kazimierz Dabrowski.
Positive disintegration, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but it basically suggests that emotional distress can actually be a sign of growth.
So like those really tough times in our lives can actually lead to positive transformation.
Exactly. It's about embracing the discomfort and using it as fuel for growth.
I'm thinking of Virginia and her panic attacks.
Oh, yes. Virginia. Those panic attacks were terrifying for her at the time.
But they ultimately led her to a major breakthrough.
They did. They forced her to confront her deeply ingrained patterns of relating to men.
She had this role self of being weak and confused around male authority figures.
And those panic attacks were like a wake-up call.
They showed her that she was stronger than she realized.
And sometimes this process of waking up involves confronting uncomfortable feelings about the people closest to us.
Even our parents.
Yes, and that can bring up a lot of guilt and shame.
Because we feel like we should love and accept them unconditionally.
But the truth is, sometimes those closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most.
And acknowledging those feelings, even if it's just to ourselves, is crucial for healing.
It's exactly. Tilly's realization that she didn't actually like her mother is a good example of this.
It was a huge revelation for her.
Because she'd spent so much of her life trying to win her mother's love and approval.
But deep down, she was resentful and angry.
And once she allowed herself to feel those feelings, she could finally start to heal.
It's like giving yourself permission to have your own experience.
And it's also important to remember that sometimes hitting rock bottom can be the catalyst for real change.
I'm thinking of Mike's story.
Yes, Mike. He lost his job and went through a divorce.
It was a really dark time for him.
But it forced him to confront his own patterns of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing.
He'd been living this healing fantasy that he would be loved if he took care of everyone else.
And when that all fell apart, he finally had to face himself.
And that's when the real healing began.
Exactly. It's often in those moments of breakdown that we find the strength to rebuild ourselves.
And this process of waking up often involves letting go of the idealized image we have of our parents.
Yes, it's about recognizing their limitations and their emotional immaturity.
Which can be a really difficult pill to swallow.
It can, but it's essential for setting healthy boundaries and reclaiming our own power.
Patsy's initial resistance to being seen as the most mature person in her family is a good example of this.
She was so used to putting her parents on a pedestal.
And it was preventing her from seeing her own strength and taking care of herself.
Exactly. And the book emphasizes the importance of recognizing and appreciating our own strengths for developing genuine self-validation.
It's about building that inner confidence that doesn't rely on external approval.
Right. And it's very much in line with Michael White's narrative therapy approach.
Where you become aware of the stories you've been telling yourself and start to rewrite them.
Exactly. You identify those limiting beliefs and consciously choose new values and principles that better support your well-being.
So once we've started to reconnect with our true selves, how do we actually navigate our interactions with emotionally immature parents?
Well, one of the biggest traps is trying to seek deep emotional intimacy from someone who's simply not capable of giving it.
So don't expect them to suddenly become emotionally available.
Exactly. Annie's experience with her mother, Betty, is a perfect example of this. She poured her heart out in a letter.
And got radio silence in return.
Exactly. It's like she was speaking a language her mother didn't understand.
So what's the alternative?
The key is to shift your focus from seeking emotional connection to managing the interactions in a more strategic way.
So be more intentional about your goals.
Exactly. And Murray Bowen's family systems theory is helpful here, particularly the concept of enmeshment.
Enmeshment? What's that?
It's basically a lack of healthy boundaries between family members.
So everyone's kind of emotionally entangled.
Right. And emotionally immature parents often promote this kind of enmeshment.
Because they need their children to meet their emotional needs.
Exactly. So instead of going into interactions hoping for empathy or validation from your parent.
Which is unlikely to happen.
Right? Instead, focus on setting specific, achievable goals for each interaction.
So what might that look like?
Well, it could be something like expressing your own thoughts or feelings calmly and clearly without needing their approval.
So just stating your truth without expecting them to understand or agree?
Exactly. Or it could be setting a specific boundary and holding firm, even if they get upset.
Or reaching a concrete agreement on a logistical matter.
Right. The key is to have a clear outcome in mind and to stay focused on that.
And what about those situations where parents get really intense or manipulative?
That can be tough because of something called emotional contagion.
Emotional contagion.
It's basically the tendency to unconsciously absorb the emotions of those around you.
So you start to feel their anxiety or anger.
Exactly. And the best way to deal with this is to practice becoming an observer.
So detach yourself from the emotional drama.
Right. Remind yourself that their emotions are ultimately theirs to manage, not yours.
Easier said than done.
It is. But even a little bit of mindful observation can help create some emotional distance.
And what about when they're being critical or blaming?
In those moments, think of yourself as a Super Bowl place kicker.
A place ticker.
Yeah, they have to stay incredibly calm and focused under immense pressure.
And you're saying we should do the same.
Exactly. Your goal isn't to win them over or argue with them. It's to stay grounded in your own emotional center.
And not get pulled into their negativity.
Right. It's about practicing emotional detachment.
What about that urge to want to make our parents happy?
That's a natural instinct, especially for internalizers.
I want to fix things.
But it's important to recognize that their happiness is ultimately their responsibility.
Can't control how they feel.
Exactly. And sometimes our efforts to make them happy can actually backfire.
Because it reinforces their dependence on us.
Right. Annie's realization that her mother's behavior was about her mother, not about her, is a good example of this.
It's about separating ourselves from their emotional baggage.
And focusing on maintaining our own sense of well-being.
So setting boundaries is key.
Absolutely. And it's important to be wary of those moments when a parent shows uncharacteristic openness or warmth.
Because it might be a way of trying to pull us back into the old patterns.
Exactly. According to Bowen's family systems theory, when a child starts to establish more independence, the parent might instinctively try to reel them back in.
So it's not necessarily genuine change.
It might be, but it's important to be cautious and not fall back into those old roles.
So the overall message is to shift our focus from trying to get our emotional needs met by our parents to managing those interactions in a way that protects our own well-being.
Exactly. It's about moving from a place of emotional reactivity to a place of thoughtful response.
And recognizing that while we can have relationships with emotionally immature parents,
Those relationships will likely never be the source of deep emotional fulfillment that we might crave.
and that's okay.
It's about letting go of those expectations and finding fulfillment elsewhere.
So how do we finally break free from those old roles and those persistent fantasies?
Well, it starts with understanding how controlling parents impact their children's inner world.
They often try to control not just our actions, but also our feelings and thoughts.
Exactly. And they might teach us to be ashamed of normal, healthy expressions of emotion.
The book lists things like enthusiasm, spontaneity, sadness, grief, uninhibited affection, saying what we really feel, expressing anger.
All perfectly normal human experiences.
But in these families, they're often seen as unacceptable or even dangerous.
Exactly. And the only acceptable emotions are things like obedience and deference to authority.
It's so stifling.
It is. And it can lead to developing a harsh inner critic that's basically a carbon copy of the parent's voice.
Jason's story about recognizing his inner critic is a good example of this.
He realized that he'd internalized his parents' disapproval.
And he had to learn to question that voice and reclaim his own sense of self.
And part of this freedom involves setting boundaries and even suspending contact with emotionally hurtful parents.
Which can be a really difficult decision.
It is. But Aisha's story shows how liberating it can be.
She experienced so much less stress and greater self-esteem after going no contact with her mother.
Because she finally prioritized her own well-being.
It's about recognizing that family ties don't give people the right to mistreat us.
Exactly. Brad's story about moving out of a stressful living situation is a good example of this.
He chose his own peace over family obligation.
And that's a sign of real strength.
And it often requires cultivating self-compassion.
Absolutely. We need to be kind to ourselves and recognize that we deserve to be treated with respect.
And that includes setting limits on those who drain our energy.
It also involves breaking free from excessive empathy.
Where we get so caught up in other people's problems that we neglect our own.
Exactly. Rebecca's realization that her desire to fix her mother was more about her own needs than her mother's capacity for change is a good example of this.
It's about recognizing our own limitations and not taking on more than we can handle.
And ultimately, it's about reclaiming our own agency.
Not feeling like victims of our past.
Carissa's success in managing interactions with her domineering father is a good example of this.
She used what the book calls the maturity awareness approach to create more balanced interactions.
And self-expression becomes a key part of this process.
It's about asserting ourselves and honoring our own truth.
Even if our parents don't understand or approve.
Holly's experience of asking her father to listen is a good example of this.
Sometimes just expressing our needs directly can make a difference.
And it's about approaching old relationships in new ways.
Setting aside those unrealistic expectations and focusing on what we can realistically achieve.
So we're not setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Exactly. And perhaps the most liberating realization is that we don't need anything emotionally from our parents.
We can find that fulfillment elsewhere.
Precisely. We can build healthy, supportive relationships with friends, partners, mentors, therapists.
We're not limited by our family of origin.
And as we start to heal those old wounds, we can start to attract more emotionally mature people into our lives.
So what should we be looking for in those relationships?
Well, emotionally mature people tend to create a sense of safety and consistency in their interactions.
They're reliable and trustworthy.
Exactly. They respect your boundaries, they're responsive to your needs, and they're generally a pleasure to be around.
Like Dan, who realized he wanted more reciprocity in his relationships.
He'd been giving so much in his marriage, but wasn't receiving the same in return.
And emotionally mature people are also able to handle change and disappointment without falling apart.
They're flexible and adaptable.
They're collaborative and open to different perspectives.
And they're willing to compromise in a way that feels fair to everyone involved.
They also express their anger in healthy ways.
They don't withdraw love or resort to silent treatment.
And they're committed to resolving conflict constructively.
They're also naturally curious about others.
They're good listeners.
And they're open to being influenced by different perspectives, which John Gottman's research has shown is crucial for healthy relationships.
And how someone responds when you tell them they've hurt you can be very telling.
Absolutely. Do they get defensive or try to blame you?
Or do they take responsibility and apologize?
Crystal's experience with her husband's infidelity highlights this.
He apologized, but didn't really understand the impact of his actions.
Right. He lacked the empathy to truly connect with her pain.
And empathy is at the core of emotional intelligence.
It's what allows us to feel safe and understood in relationships.
Emotionally mature people also tend to see you in a positive light.
They remember your strengths, and they create a climate of acceptance where you can be yourself.
And they use humor in a healthy way.
Not as a shield or a weapon, but as a way to connect and lighten the mood.
So ultimately, we're looking for people who are kindly, compassionate, and emotionally available.
Exactly. People who make us feel seen and heard and valued.
And the book also encourages us to develop new relationship habits ourselves.
Like being willing to ask for help.
And being authentically ourselves, even if it means risking disapproval.
And believing that we deserve support and love.
And setting boundaries when we need to.
And communicating our needs clearly.
So it's a two-way street.
It is, we need to do our part to create healthy, fulfilling relationships.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding emotional immaturity can be incredibly liberating.
It helps us break free from those old patterns and create a more authentic life.
Exactly. And for anyone who's resonating with these ideas, I encourage you to keep exploring this topic.
Read Lindsay Gibson's book, Seek Out Therapy if you need it.
And remember that healing is possible.
You're not alone in this.
And the more we understand about ourselves and our families, the more empowered we become to create the relationships we truly desire.
So true. Well, this